So Russia just launched a massive winter counteroffensive across multiple sectors of the Ukrainian front. And we're not talking about limited probing attacks or incremental pressure. We're talking about a coordinated assault involving over 150,000 troops, thousands of armored vehicles, and the largest concentration of Russian air power deployed since the initial invasion in February 2022. On January 12th, Russian forces began simultaneous pushes in the Donbas region toward Kharkiv in the northeast, and in a completely unexpected thrust toward Zaporizhia in the south that caught Ukrainian defenders off guard. It's honestly hard to believe that after nearly 3 years of grinding warfare that has depleted Russian military resources and left hundreds of thousands of casualties, Putin has managed to assemble an offensive capability of this magnitude. But guess what? That's exactly what intelligence assessments from NATO confirm has happened. And the implications are sending shockwaves through European capitals that thought the war had settled into a sustainable stalemate. This isn't just about territorial gains in Ukraine or the immediate military situation on the ground. We're talking about a fundamental challenge to NATO's strategic assumptions. Questions about whether Western support for Ukraine has been adequate, and potentially the most serious test of the Atlantic Alliance's unity and resolve since the Cold War ended. And trust me, the fact that this offensive is achieving tactical successes in multiple locations is forcing European leaders to confront possibilities they desperately wanted to avoid. Let me fill you in on what's been developing. Vladimir Putin has been planning this counteroffensive for months, carefully husbanding resources, while Western analysts convinced themselves that Russian military capabilities had been fundamentally degraded. Throughout late 2025, Russia implemented a partial mobilization that brought approximately 300,000 additional troops into uniform. These weren't the poorly trained conscripts and prison recruits that characterized earlier mobilization waves. According to reporting from the Washington Post published on January 14th, Russia devoted substantial resources to training programs lasting 3 to 4 months, providing these forces with better equipment than previous mobilizations and organizing them into newly formed combined arms units rather than using them as individual replacements. Whether it was establishing new training centers in the Russian interior, coordinating with Belarus to use their facilities for large unit exercises, or conducting realistic rehearsals of offensive operations, Putin really cemented himself as committed to rebuilding offensive capability regardless of the economic and human costs. He made it clear that accepting the current stalemate was unacceptable, that Ukraine needed to be defeated decisively, and that Russia would commit whatever resources were necessary to achieve that objective. But here's where the rubber meets the road. We're now 5 days into this counteroffensive, and the battlefield results are genuinely alarming for Ukrainian forces and their NATO backers. Russian forces have penetrated Ukrainian defensive lines in at least 3 locations. Ukrainian ammunition stocks are running critically low after months of delayed Western aid packages. European NATO members are facing the reality that their own military stockpiles have been depleted by transfers to Ukraine, and that their defense industrial bases cannot rapidly scale production. American political support for continued large-scale assistance remains uncertain as the Trump administration reviews Ukraine policy. This crisis is unfolding because European nations convinced themselves that modest support for Ukraine would be sufficient to maintain stalemate indefinitely, while they avoided the political and economic costs of fully mobilizing their own resources. And guess who's stuck right in the middle trying to salvage this situation? Yep, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and the defense ministers of major European powers who are supposed to be coordinating an effective alliance response. They're supposed to be managing a cohesive strategy based on shared threat assessments and burden-sharing principles. But here's the kicker. European nations aren't unified on how much risk to accept or how much to sacrifice. Some want to dramatically increase support for Ukraine, even if that means accepting economic costs and potential escalation risks, while others are quietly exploring whether accommodation with Russia might be preferable to open-ended commitment. And before we go any further, let's be real for a second. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a clear violation of international law and the UN Charter's prohibition on territorial conquest by force. The human suffering inflicted on Ukrainian civilians has been immense. With credible allegations of widespread war crimes, there are absolutely legitimate moral and strategic arguments for supporting Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But the question here isn't whether Russia's invasion was wrong or whether Ukraine deserves support. The question is whether NATO has developed an effective strategy for actually achieving its stated objective of enabling Ukraine to defend itself successfully, whether European nations are willing to pay the costs that strategy requires, and what happens if the current approach is failing. Now back to the matter at hand. Reports from around January 13th revealed just how serious the battlefield situation has become. According to the New York Times reporting on January 15th, based on Ukrainian military sources, Russian forces achieved a breakthrough near Kremenna in the Luhansk region, penetrating approximately 12 kilometers into Ukrainian-held territory. Russian armored columns, supported by intensive artillery preparation and close air support, overwhelmed Ukrainian defensive positions that lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained engagement. Ukrainian forces were compelled to conduct a fighting withdrawal to secondary defensive lines, ceding territory that had been held since the 2023 counteroffensive. Talk about a significant tactical setback. Essentially, Russia demonstrated that where it can achieve local superiority in firepower and can effectively coordinate combined arms operations, Ukrainian forces, despite their proven skill and determination, cannot hold positions indefinitely without adequate ammunition and equipment. And this wasn't an isolated incident at a minor location. Russian forces made these kinds of gains in multiple sectors, making it clear that this represented a systematic problem with Ukraine's ability to sustain defense across the entire front line. This battlefield success sent shockwaves through NATO headquarters in Brussels because it challenged fundamental assumptions that had guided alliance policy for months. If Russian offensive capability remained strong enough to achieve breakthrough operations despite years of attrition, and if Ukrainian forces could be pushed back due to ammunition shortages despite tactical competence, what did that mean for the entire strategic approach of providing Ukraine just enough support to maintain stalemate without risking escalation? Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Western assumptions about Russian military decline prove overly optimistic. Putin's approach to warfare really only requires achieving his political objectives, not meeting Western standards of military effectiveness or minimizing casualties. Whenever analysts predicted that Russian forces were exhausted or incapable of further offensive operations, Putin proved willing to mobilize additional resources regardless of costs. We've spotted this pattern time and again throughout this conflict. Just think about how Western intelligence assessed in spring 2022 that Russian forces were spent after failing to take Kyiv. Analysts predicted Russia couldn't sustain major operations, but by summer 2022, Russia had regrouped and launched a grinding offensive in the Donbass that made significant territorial gains through sheer firepower superiority. So Ukrainian forces eventually stabilized the situation, but the prediction of Russian collapse proved premature. Then there was the period after Ukraine's successful Kharkiv counteroffensive in September 2022. Putin wasn't pleased about those defeats, but rather than accepting them as permanent, he announced a partial mobilization that brought 300,000 additional troops into the fight. Western analysts said these poorly trained, mobilized forces couldn't change the fundamental balance, but those forces allowed Russia to establish defensive lines in the south and east that stopped Ukrainian advances cold. And let's not forget how Western assessments in early 2023 predicted that Russia's military industry couldn't sustain the conflict because of sanctions and component shortages. Russia was supposedly running out of precision weapons, artillery shells, and armored vehicles. Yet by late 2023, Russian military production had increased substantially through domestic manufacturing expansion, sanctions evasion, and support from Iran and North Korea. Russia was firing more artillery shells per day in late 2023 than in early 2022, directly contradicting predictions of inevitable decline. Even Ukraine's 2023 summer counteroffensive faced more formidable Russian defenses than Western militaries had anticipated, with extensive minefields, prepared positions, and effective use of artillery and helicopters preventing the breakthrough that NATO planners had expected. Now, it looks like assumptions about Russian offensive exhaustion are being shattered. Once again, this pattern is becoming all too familiar. Western intelligence and political leaders want to believe that Russia's capacity for violence and mobilization has limits that will be reached soon, but Putin demonstrates time after time that he's willing to pay far higher costs in blood and treasure than Western societies would tolerate, and that Russia's authoritarian system allows him to mobilize resources without facing the political constraints democratic leaders face. So what did NATO do to end up in a position where this Russian counteroffensive could achieve such concerning results? Well, it all boils down to fundamental disagreements about strategy, burden sharing, and acceptable risk that were never properly resolved. The alliance structure created expectations that all members would contribute to supporting Ukraine, while individual nations made calculations based on their own political pressures, economic constraints, and threat perceptions. And the impasse developed because the United States wanted European allies to take primary responsibility for supporting a war in their region, while European nations wanted American leadership and resources to carry the main burden. Different European nations wanted different outcomes, with Eastern European members viewing Russia as an existential threat, requiring maximum support for Ukraine, while some Western European nations worried more about economic disruption and escalation risks. Ultimately, NATO never developed a truly unified strategy, with each member providing support based on domestic political considerations rather than strategic requirements. As the alliance's largest European military power, Germany decided to take a cautious and incremental approach. Chancellor Olaf Scholz carefully calibrated German support to avoid actions he feared could trigger escalation, such as providing long-range weapons or allowing German-supplied systems to strike Russian territory. He balanced support for Ukraine against concerns about energy security, economic impact, and historical sensitivities about German military action. His approach seemed to be provide substantial financial aid, offer defensive weapons, coordinate with allies, but avoid crossing Russian red lines or taking actions that might transform Germany into a direct party to the conflict. At first, this cautious approach had support from significant portions of German public opinion and from some other European leaders who shared concerns about escalation. Scholz appreciates being viewed as responsible and thoughtful, not as reckless or provocative. But here's where things started to go wrong. As the war extended through 2024 and into 2025, serious problems emerged with this incremental approach. Ukraine was burning through ammunition faster than Western production could replace it. Russian military industry was ramping up production while sanctions proved less effective than hoped. European defense stockpiles were being depleted without clear plans for reconstitution. While Germany maintained its cautious stance, other allies were growing frustrated with what they viewed as insufficient urgency. According to a Politico Europe report from January 10th, tensions had been building for months between Germany and Poland over Ukraine's strategy. Polish officials privately criticized what they viewed as German reluctance to fully commit to Ukraine's defense. Public opinion across Europe began shifting as people realized the conflict wouldn't end quickly and that Russia might actually be winning the attrition battle. Polling data from late 2025 showed increasing concern about inadequate support for Ukraine and growing anxiety about Russian aggression. This was the moment when the gap between NATO's stated commitments and actual resource allocation became a critical vulnerability. You see, NATO members valued projecting unity and resolve, appearing strong against Russian aggression, and supporting Ukrainian sovereignty. But they didn't want to accept the economic disruption of actually mobilizing defense industries to wartime production levels, face the political backlash of significantly increasing defense spending beyond the 2% GDP target, or risk the escalation that might come from providing Ukraine everything needed to actually defeat Russia decisively. That's definitely not the comfortable middle ground they were seeking. And then Russia launched this massive counteroffensive, and suddenly the costs of the incremental approach became devastatingly apparent. Ukraine started losing ground because ammunition shortages prevented effective defense. Ukrainian commanders were forced to ration artillery shells, firing perhaps 2,000 rounds per day, while Russian forces fired over 10,000. Ukrainian air defense units had insufficient missiles to protect against Russian aviation, allowing Russian jets to provide close air support that had previously been too risky. NATO's incremental support strategy that assumed stalemate could be maintained indefinitely was revealed as based on hope rather than hard military calculation. But then, when European leaders began discussing dramatically increasing support to address these shortfalls, they ran into massive political and economic obstacles. According to Financial Times reporting on January 16th, European defense ministers held emergency consultations on January 14th to discuss responses to the Russian offensive, but they confronted harsh realities about their actual military capabilities and industrial capacity. European ammunition production remains at roughly 300,000 artillery rounds annually, while Ukraine has been using over 100,000 rounds monthly during intense fighting. Scaling production to levels that could actually supply Ukraine's needs while reconstituting European stockpiles would require investments of tens of billions of euros and would take years to fully implement. European defense industries lack the workforce, factory capacity, and supply chains to rapidly surge production. In Trump's eyes and those of his closest advisors, Europeans of talking about increasing support while lacking capability to actually deliver represents exactly the kind of weakness and free riding that he's complained about for years. Discussing ambitious support packages without the industrial base to fulfill them, that's pure fantasy disguised as policy. Any ally that can't actually produce the weapons and ammunition needed when tested by real conflict is fundamentally not serious about defense. Now, this left European leaders in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, they desperately need to demonstrate capability and resolve, both to reassure Ukraine and to maintain credibility with their own populations who are watching Russian advances with alarm. Poland, the Baltic states, and Nordic countries will view inadequate response as existential weakness that invites future Russian aggression against NATO members themselves. Political pressure is intense to show that NATO can respond effectively to Russian military action. On the flip side, they actually have to confront the reality of depleted stockpiles, limited production capacity, fiscal constraints, and the years it would take to build the defense industrial base required for sustained high-intensity conflict. The tricky part is that closing the gap between commitments and capabilities requires economic and political costs that many European publics are reluctant to accept. So European leaders are caught in a devastating bind. They can either make dramatic new commitments to support Ukraine, which means mobilizing economies in ways not seen since the Cold War, accepting significant economic disruption and fiscal costs, and risking their political futures on unpopular military spending increases. That approach might eventually provide Ukraine what it needs, but could cost political leaders their positions before the support actually materializes, or they can acknowledge the limitations of what they can realistically provide given current capabilities, which means accepting that Ukraine might lose territory or be forced into an unfavorable negotiated settlement. But that would shatter NATO credibility, confirm Russian perceptions that Western resolve is performative rather than genuine, and potentially invite further Russian aggression against alliance members. It's an impossible situation, and that's the strategic trap that years of incremental half measures have created for European NATO members. They made commitments to support Ukraine's sovereignty and to resist Russian aggression, but they avoided making the investments and accepting the costs that would be required to fulfill those commitments if seriously tested. Now, that Russia has called the bluff by demonstrating offensive capability that challenges those commitments, European leaders are discovering that strong rhetoric without adequate resources is just empty words. This whole scenario is causing massive stress and division within the NATO alliance. If Russia can achieve territorial gains through a major offensive despite years of Western support for Ukraine, every NATO member is left questioning whether the alliance's strategy has been fundamentally flawed. Those Eastern European members who have been warning that Russia remains a serious military threat and that in tough measures would prove insufficient are feeling validated but also terrified. Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Romania are now calculating that if NATO couldn't provide Ukraine, a highly motivated partner fighting on its own territory with adequate support to prevent Russian advances, how can they trust that NATO would successfully defend them in a crisis? Meanwhile, some Western European nations are quietly reconsidering whether continued confrontation with Russia serves their interests. France, under President Macron, has historically maintained some openness to eventual accommodation with Russia. Once the Ukraine situation stabilizes, Germany faces massive economic pressure from energy costs and trade disruption. Italy and Hungary have political factions arguing that European interests would be better served by negotiated settlement rather than open-ended conflict. The unity that NATO projected throughout 2022 and 2023 is showing serious fractures as the costs of the conflict extend and the prospects of clear Ukrainian victory recede. Things became even more complicated when reports emerged on January 15th that Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban had conducted a phone call with Vladimir Putin. According to Reuters reporting, Orban discussed potential frameworks for negotiations to end the conflict. Hungary has consistently been the most reluctant NATO member regarding support for Ukraine, blocking or delaying various assistance packages and maintaining closer relations with Russia than other alliance members. But Orban conducting direct negotiations with Putin without coordinating with other NATO allies represents a serious breach of alliance unity. It signals to Russia that NATO consensus is fragile and that sustained pressure might fracture the coalition. When a NATO member state's leader is conducting independent negotiations with the adversary during an active military crisis, alliance cohesion is in serious trouble. This isn't routine diplomatic outreach. It's a member breaking ranks on the central security challenge facing the alliance. The message it sends to Moscow is that sustained military pressure can break Western unity and create opportunities for diplomatic solutions on Russian terms. The uncertainty in American policy is compounding European anxiety enormously. The Trump administration has sent profoundly mixed signals about its Ukraine policy since taking office. President Trump has repeatedly stated that he could end the war quickly through negotiations, which many interpret as willingness to pressure Ukraine into accepting territorial losses. According to NBC News reporting from January 11th, Trump spoke with Putin by phone on January 9th without Ukrainian officials participating or apparently even being notified in advance. The substance of that conversation remains unclear, but the optics of the American president conducting direct talks with Russia about Ukraine's future without Ukrainian involvement were devastating for European confidence in American leadership. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attempted to reassure European allies during a NATO ministerial meeting on January 14th, stating that American support for NATO remains solid and that the United States would consult closely with allies on Ukraine policy. But Rubio's reassurances were undermined within hours when President Trump posted on social media questioning why American taxpayers should continue funding a war in Europe when European nations weren't doing enough themselves. This whiplash between official reassurances and presidential statements creates profound uncertainty about whether America will maintain support for Ukraine or will pursue separate negotiations with Russia, regardless of European preferences. European leaders are discovering that their security architecture for the past 75 years has rested on assumptions about American commitment that may no longer hold. If the United States under Trump views European defense as primarily a European responsibility and views the Ukraine conflict as a burden to be shed rather than a test of alliance credibility, then European nations face choices they desperately hope to avoid. They would need to either dramatically increase their own defense capabilities and accept primary responsibility for containing Russia, or they would need to reach accommodation with Russia from a position of weakness after their strategy of relying on American leadership and limited European contributions has failed. The military situation on the ground continues deteriorating in ways that make these strategic dilemmas more acute. Russian forces are consolidating gains made in the failing, and that Europe may face choices between accepting Ukrainian defeat or accepting direct confrontation risks. Russia is clearly aware of NATO's internal divisions and is calibrating its offensive to exploit them. Putin is demonstrating military capability sufficient to pressure Ukraine and alarm Europe without yet taking actions so extreme that they would force NATO unity. Russian forces are focusing on grinding territorial gains rather than dramatic thrusts toward major cities that might trigger crisis responses. Putin is keeping diplomatic channels open, including through intermediaries like Hungary, suggesting that negotiated outcomes remain possible if the West accepts Russian territorial gains and Ukrainian neutrality. This calibrated approach aims to demoralize Ukraine and divide NATO without triggering the kind of unified response that a more dramatic escalation might provoke. It's a carefully managed campaign designed to create a sense of inevitable Russian victory and Western impotence without creating a Pearl Harbor moment that would galvanize alliance cohesion. The strategy reflects sophisticated understanding of Western political dynamics and alliance decision-making processes. Chinese positioning on the conflict adds another complex dimension. China has maintained nominal neutrality while providing substantial economic support to Russia that has helped Putin sustain the war effort. According to U.S. intelligence assessments reported by the Wall Street Journal on January 15th, Chinese companies are providing dual-use technologies and components that have military applications, helping Russia evade the impact of Western sanctions. China hasn't provided direct military support in terms of weapon systems, but the economic lifeline has been crucial to Russian staying power. China is watching carefully how NATO responds to this crisis because it informs Chinese calculations about Taiwan and broader competition with the United States. If NATO proves unable to effectively support Ukraine and Russian territorial gains are consolidated, that suggests to Beijing that Western resolve and capability may be insufficient to prevent Chinese actions in areas of core interest. If Western alliance unity fractures under Russian military pressure, that confirms Chinese assessments that the American alliance system is brittle and unreliable when seriously tested. Conversely, if NATO successfully rallies to stabilize the situation despite current difficulties, that would send concerning signals to Beijing about collective Western capability. The economic dimensions of the crisis are also intensifying. European energy markets are experiencing renewed volatility as Russia hints at further supply restrictions. Natural gas prices have increased approximately 30% since the offensive began. As markets price in heightened supply uncertainty, this creates additional pressure on European governments already struggling with inflation and low growth. The economic costs of dramatically increasing defense production and military support for Ukraine would come on top of energy costs and broader economic challenges, making the political lift even more difficult. Financial markets are reflecting broader uncertainty about European security and economic stability. European stock markets declined approximately 8% in the week following the offensive's launch. The euro weakened against the dollar as investors sought safe havens. Bond spreads for peripheral European nations widened as investors worried about fiscal capacity to fund both economic support and defense increases simultaneously. While financial markets often overreact to security crises, the magnitude and persistence of these moves suggests genuine concern about the implications of current developments. So let's break down what this Russian counteroffensive could mean for the future, because it's not just a dramatic military development, it has profound implications for European security architecture, NATO's credibility and cohesion, American foreign policy, and the broader international order. First up is the immediate crisis of Ukraine's military situation. Ukraine needs massive quantities of ammunition, air defense systems, armored vehicles, and other equipment to stabilize current lines and prevent further Russian advances. The quantities required exceed what European nations can provide from stockpiles without catastrophically undermining their own defenses. Ramping up production to meet Ukraine's needs while reconstituting European stockpiles requires industrial mobilization that would take years to fully implement in the immediate term. Only the United States has stockpiles sufficient to potentially make a decisive difference, but American willingness to commit those resources remains uncertain under current political leadership. If Western nations cannot or will not provide what Ukraine needs in the next several weeks, Ukrainian forces may be compelled to continue ceding territory. The psychological and political impacts of sustained territorial losses would be devastating for Ukrainian morale and governance. The Zelensky government's legitimacy rests substantially on its commitment to defending Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. Visible failure to prevent Russian advances due to insufficient Western support would create a political crisis within Ukraine while strengthening Russian negotiating leverage. Democrats and traditional national security Republicans in the United States will argue that this crisis demonstrates the necessity of robust American leadership and support for Ukraine as a test of credibility with allies and adversaries. Worldwide, they'll point to the consequences of inadequate support and argue that American retreat would invite aggression globally. They'll have statements from European allies, analysis from security experts, and evidence of Russian advances to support arguments that more support is essential. This will be central to Democratic messaging in 2026 about the dangers of isolationism and retreat from global leadership. Now, let's touch on what this means for NATO as an institution. The alliance has been the cornerstone of European and transatlantic security for 75 years, providing the framework for collective defense and political coordination. But this crisis is revealing that NATO's effectiveness depends on credible military capability and unified political will, both of which are being questioned. European members have allowed their military capabilities to atrophy during decades of relative peace, assuming American power would compensate for European weakness. That assumption is being tested as American commitment becomes uncertain and European needs exceed European capacity. The situation shines a massive spotlight on burden sharing and collective defense commitments. At the heart of NATO is Article 5's commitment that an attack on one is an attack on all. But if the alliance cannot effectively support Ukraine, which isn't even a member, how credible is the commitment to defend actual members if Russia tests those commitments? Eastern European NATO members are asking this question urgently. They see that years of Western support haven't prevented Russian military success in Ukraine. They wonder whether Article 5 guarantees would actually translate to effective defense if they faced Russian attack, or whether they would receive the same incremental, insufficient support that has characterized Ukraine assistance. The founders of NATO designed the alliance with the understanding that collective security required both formal commitments and actual military capability to fulfill those commitments. They created integrated command structures, stationed forces forward, and maintained substantial military capabilities because they understood that deterrence required credible capacity to defend. During the Cold War, NATO maintained forces and infrastructure specifically designed to repel Soviet attack. The current situation suggests that post-Cold War assumptions that such preparations were no longer necessary may have been dangerously wrong. But major European powers have been deeply uncomfortable with the costs and implications of actually rebuilding Cold War-level military capabilities. They prefer to believe that economic integration, diplomatic engagement, and modest military improvements would be sufficient. If this crisis forces acknowledgement that serious military capability is actually necessary for security, it requires transformational changes in defense spending, industrial policy, and political culture that many European societies have been resisting. So the implications of this case reach far beyond just the current military situation in Ukraine. It's about whether NATO can adapt to a security environment where Russia remains a serious military threat requiring substantial conventional deterrence and defense capabilities. Each time alliance members make commitments without providing resources to fulfill them, or project unity while pursuing divergent policies, it weakens the alliance's credibility. It starts making the gap between rhetoric and reality so obvious that adversaries are emboldened and allies lose confidence. Think about the broader implications. If Russia can achieve military success against Western-supported Ukraine despite years of support and training, what does that suggest about NATO's ability to actually defend member states against serious attack? If European NATO members cannot produce ammunition and weapons in quantities necessary for high-intensity conflict, how would they sustain operations in actual war? If alliance unity fractures under pressure from a regional conflict where no member has been directly attacked, how would it hold together in an Article 5 scenario where members face actual invasion? These aren't abstract questions. They're fundamental issues about whether the security architecture that has protected Europe for 3/4 of a century remains fit for purpose. Democracy and the rules-based international order rely on alliances that can actually deter aggression through credible capability and on principles of sovereignty being defended rather than just discussed. When those foundations erode, the entire structure of international security starts to crumble. Looking ahead to both 2026 midterm elections and 2028 presidential race, it's clear that this crisis is going to have massive electoral effects. We're still months away from 2026 voting, but the narrative being established now will shape campaigns fundamentally. If the story is Russia achieving military success while NATO proves unable to respond effectively, and American retreat from leadership accelerating European security crisis that provides powerful ammunition for Democrats arguing that Trump's foreign policy is catastrophically weakening American interests and alliances. Voters have historically not rewarded presidents or parties associated with American weakness or allied collapse. Conversely, if Trump successfully negotiates an end to the conflict on terms that can be presented as reasonable while avoiding further American resource commitment, that would provide a powerful counter-narrative about deal-making and ending forever wars. The political battle will be over which interpretation prevails, with voters who don't follow foreign policy details closely but respond to broad narratives about strength versus weakness and engagement versus overextension. So here's the deal. Russia has launched a major counteroffensive that's achieving tactical successes across multiple sectors of the Ukrainian front. NATO is discovering that its strategy of incremental support has left Ukraine critically vulnerable due to ammunition shortages and industrial capacity limitations. European allies are divided about how to respond and are discovering that their military capabilities may be inadequate for the security challenges they face. American commitment under the Trump administration remains uncertain, creating fundamental questions about the transatlantic alliance that has anchored Western security for 75 years. This isn't just about territory in eastern Ukraine or even about Ukraine's ultimate fate as a sovereign nation. It's about whether NATO remains a credible military alliance capable of defending its members, or whether it's becoming a political talking shop that makes commitments it cannot fulfill. It's about whether democracies can mobilize resources and sustain will to deter authoritarian aggression, or whether authoritarian systems have fundamental advantages in long-term competition because they can impose costs their populations cannot resist. It's about whether the rules-based international order that prohibits territorial conquest can be enforced, or whether might makes right remains the actual governing principle of international relations. If NATO cannot rally to stabilize Ukraine's situation despite years of warning and preparation, then the alliance's credibility as a defensive pact becomes questionable. That would mean we're entering a fundamentally different security environment where European nations can no longer rely on collective defense and must either dramatically enhance their own capabilities or accept vulnerability to Russian pressure and potential aggression. So keep an eye on the situation very closely. Things are developing rapidly. NATO defense ministers are scheduled for another emergency meeting on January 20th to attempt agreement on concrete support measures. The European Council will hold emergency sessions next week to discuss both immediate military support and longer-term defense industrial policy. President Trump is expected to speak with European leaders this week, though whether those conversations will reassure allies or create additional uncertainty remains to be seen. Ukrainian forces are fighting to stabilize defensive lines, but the next several days will be crucial in determining whether they can prevent further Russian breakthroughs or whether the situation will continue deteriorating. Legal and policy experts will be watching to see if this crisis finally forces the transformation in European defense policy and spending that has been discussed but never implemented. Military analysts are assessing whether Russian offensive capability is as regenerated as current operations suggest, or whether this represents a final surge using resources that cannot be sustained. Intelligence services are working to understand the extent of Chinese support for Russia and whether that support might extend to direct military assistance if the conflict intensifies further. The next few weeks are going to be absolutely crucial in determining the future of European security, NATO's viability as a military alliance, and the broader trajectory of international order. We're witnessing what could be the most significant test of Western security architecture since the end of the Cold War. This isn't hyperbole or exaggeration. The combination of Russian military success, NATO division and capability limitations, uncertain American commitment, and fundamental questions about whether democracies can compete with authoritarian systems in sustained conflict creates a genuinely historic moment. The stakes have never been higher. If this situation is mishandled, the consequences could include Ukrainian defeat or dismemberment, collapse of NATO credibility, Russian emboldening to test alliance commitments against actual members, Chinese conclusions that the time is right for Taiwan operations, and fundamental transformation of international order away from rules-based systems towards spheres of influence and great power competition. If the situation is handled effectively through dramatic increases in support and alliance cohesion, it could demonstrate that democracies can rally when threatened and that collective security remains viable. But that outcome requires political will and resource commitment that hasn't been evident yet. The outcome remains genuinely uncertain, the divisions profound, and the consequences of failure catastrophic. This ride is far from over. We're just entering the most dangerous phase.